You see the pause first. A question that once drew a quick, shaky answer now produces a small trail of notes, arithmetic, caveats, and corrections before it commits. The final answer may look almost ordinary. What feels different is the root. The system appears to slow down, inspect its own work, and arrive somewhere more reliable. That can look like a breakthrough in intelligence. It is tempting to imagine that something new switched on behind the screen. The plainer explanation is less dramatic. It learned to write longer before answering, and that extra writing can make some tasks easier to finish correctly. There is no need to picture a new mental organ appearing inside it. The visible change is a learned behavior. Use the output stream for working, not just for conclusions. You already know the human version. When a problem is difficult, writing down the steps can prevent you from losing track of a condition, a carry, or an earlier assumption. The system can do something similar with its generated text. Each new piece of text becomes part of the context it can use when producing the next piece. That matters because a short answer has little room to recover. If its first move is wrong, it may rush directly from that mistake to a polished conclusion. A longer response creates more chances to lay out a calculation, compare alternatives, notice a mismatch, or restate the question in a more useful form. This is what people usually mean by a chain of thought. It is extra generated material before the answer. Words, symbols, partial calculations, checks, and intermediate decisions. The chain does not have to sound like a neat school solution. It can be fragmented, repetitive, or strangely phrased, because its immediate job is to help produce the next token. So the apparent pause is not proof of a hidden new faculty. Often, it is the visible cost of giving the same basic kind of system more room to work. You can call this a draft before the reply. Instead of committing immediately, the system generates provisional material that can shape what follows. The comparison is useful, but only up to a point. Your rough notes may reflect experiences, intentions, and a private sense of uncertainty. This trail is still text selected one piece at a time. That means a displayed explanation is not a direct window into an inner process. It may be useful working material, a polished reconstruction, or a mixture of both. What matters mechanically is simpler. Earlier generated tokens remain available as context, so a later token can refer back to a subtotal, a definition, or an alternative it just produced. With enough space, a large task can become several smaller ones. It can identify the relevant quantities, perform one operation, then use that result in the next operation. It can also keep temporary facts in view. A condition stated near the beginning is less likely to vanish when the system has written a compact reminder of it along the way. Extra steps provide opportunities for comparison. If two roots produce incompatible results, the mismatch can become another piece of evidence before the final answer is chosen. They also make revision possible in a limited, practical sense. A poor first approach can be followed by a correction, rather than being locked into a one-shot response. None of this guarantees that the correction is right. A longer trail can preserve an error, decorate an error, or confidently invent a check that does not actually check anything. But on tasks where success depends on keeping track of several linked details, the additional workspace can raise the odds. The benefit comes from more generated computation spread across more steps. This is why the effect is uneven. Simple questions may gain little, while arithmetic, planning, constraint tracking, and multi-part comparisons can benefit from having room to unfold. The important shift is not that it acquired a mysterious inner narrator. It learned that, for some problems, saying more before answering can make the final answer less like a first guess. Consider a calculation with several operations, a unit conversion, and one exception hidden in the wording. A response that jumps straight to the end has many places to make a small mistake without noticing it. Writing intermediate results changes the task. Each number can be carried forward, and each operation can be inspected against the condition that produced it. Planning works similarly. If you ask for a route that must fit a budget, avoid conflicts, preserve an order, and meet a deadline, each requirement narrows the next choice. A visible plan can list those requirements before choosing among options. That does not make the choices wise by itself, but it makes forgotten constraints easier to detect. Careful comparisons also benefit. When two proposals differ across cost, timing, risk, and trade-offs, a quick answer may seize on the most obvious feature and neglect the rest. Puzzles expose the same weakness more sharply. One mistaken assumption near the start can make every later statement appear consistent, because the later work is built on the wrong foundation. In all these cases, the first answer may be little more than a plausible guess. The system has seen patterns like the question before, and one familiar-looking answer can arrive quickly. A short format pressures that guess into becoming a commitment. There may be no room to separate what was assumed, what was calculated, and what was merely predicted as likely. More working creates a second chance. The initial direction can be tested against the details, and a contradiction can sometimes redirect the response before it reaches you. That habit is not installed as a new mental organ. During training, the system encounters examples where intermediate routes are associated with answers that turn out better than immediate replies. It is therefore encouraged to produce sequences that tend to reach correct outcomes. Identify the pieces, apply a rule, preserve a constraint, check the result, then answer. What it learns is a useful pattern of output. So when it seems to think aloud, you are watching a learned use of extra turns. The answer is no longer just the first shape that appears in the dark. It has spent time feeling along the path. Some of those routes are rewarded more often than others. If a response breaks a problem into relevant steps and reaches the target reliably, training makes that style easier to produce again. This is practice with feedback, not a hidden chamber being switched on. A route that repeatedly leads somewhere useful gains weight, while routes that wander, contradict themselves, or miss the target become less inviting. The feedback need not praise every word equally. What matters is that the overall approach tends to produce an answer that survives checking better than a fast, unsupported leap. Over many examples, familiar moves can become available in sequence. State the condition, keep track of what changed, compare alternatives, test the awkward case, and only then settle on a conclusion. That sequence can look remarkably like deliberation, because it often functions like deliberation. But its source is learned behavior under pressure to reach better results, using more of the available output space. The written trace, however, is not sacred evidence. A fluent explanation can be neat because neat explanations are common and useful, not because each sentence is a complete record of every cause inside the system. It can also be incomplete. The response may omit a detour, compress several operations into one sentence, or present a cleaner route after arriving at the answer by a less orderly one. And sometimes the trace is simply wrong. It may sound methodical while carrying a bad assumption forward, especially when the task resembles a familiar pattern closely enough to encourage confidence. So the working is best treated as behavior you can inspect and sometimes challenge. It can expose assumptions, support checking, and make revision possible, but it does not certify itself merely by being long. Slowness earns its keep when the task contains dependencies. If one choice changes what later choices permit, pausing to preserve the chain can prevent an early convenience from becoming a final mistake. It also helps when rules must all be satisfied, quantities must remain consistent, or several plausible paths compete. In those settings, extra steps are not decoration. They are a place to hold constraints long enough to compare them. There is no guarantee that more visible working will always find the right route. But when the answer lies beyond the first familiar shape, the learned habit of feeling along the path can be worth more than a quick voice in the dark. The same habit has a limit. A longer path gives the system more places to lose the path. Each added sentence is another chance to introduce a detail that was never needed. A simple question can acquire imaginary conditions, side cases, and exceptions. The system may begin by solving the actual problem, then keep talking until it has built a harder one beside it. This is not always visible as an obvious error. It can look like care. Definitions are refined, assumptions are qualified, and distant possibilities are considered long after they stop changing the answer. Sometimes the first answer was correct and appropriately plain. More generated text can then become a mechanism for doubting it, replacing a stable solution with an elaborate but weaker one. The trace also has to remain internally coherent. A fresh claim made halfway through becomes another object to track, so length can increase the burden of maintaining the very reasoning it was meant to support. That is why thinking out loud is not a universal upgrade. It is a learned strategy with useful failure modes, like checking your work by rewriting it until you accidentally change a correct line. There is a physical cost behind this verbal length as well. Producing each next piece of text requires another round of processing through the system. A short reply reaches an endpoint quickly. A long working trace repeatedly asks the machine to consider what has already been written, combine it with the prompt, and choose what comes next. So extra reasoning tokens are not free punctuation around an answer. They consume machine time, increase the weight, and occupy capacity that could have handled another request. When you ask for every step, the request may become more reliable on the kinds of problems that reward careful sequencing. It also becomes heavier to serve, even if the final answer is only a few words. That trade-off must appear somewhere, in how long you wait, how much capacity is available, or what the service can afford to provide. Deliberation is not a new organ added to the machine. It is more work performed over more time. The useful question is not whether it can narrate a mind. It is whether this particular dark path needs a lantern, or whether the first clear step was enough. You can treat the request as having a budget. Some tasks need an immediate answer, some deserve a brief verification, and some justify a longer attempt with room for detours. A familiar fact, a simple classification, or a direct rewrite may gain little from a sprawling trace. More text can merely create more places to drift. A calculation with several dependent steps is different. So is a plan whose later choices depend on earlier constraints being kept visible. For those jobs, you are not asking for theatrical introspection. You are allocating additional passes to maintain state, test an intermediate result, and recover from a bad branch. The useful design is therefore selective. Give easy work a short route, give uncertain work a checkpoint, and reserve the long route for problems where intermediate work can change the outcome. That choice can be made by the system, by the person using it, or by a simple limit on time and length. None of those choices makes the trace a mystical faculty. There are problems where a long written path is genuinely better than a jump. If the answer depends on linked operations, constraints, or careful comparison, skipping the middle can remove the work that matters. What looked like a new mind was often a system given room to leave a paper trail before it spoke. A lantern on the dark path, useful when the path truly needs one.